Hello and welcome to this King's Gambit video featuring Bobby Fischer playing against an average chess player. So if you've ever wondered, what it would have been like to play in a simultaneous exhibition where you would have a chance to play against Bobby Fischer, well, maybe this will give you a little taste of that. Now, I pulled up the computer with 5 different lines. That way, as we go through these moves, we can see what the computer thinks of Bobby Fischer's moves and his opponent's moves. So this game took place in New York in 1964 in a simultaneous exhibition. I'm not sure how many players Fischer played at the same time, but let's get started here. And Bobby Fischer, known to be an e4 player, of course, he begins with e4, which he said was best by test. He felt that if you wanted to go for an advantage, that e4 was a good way to do it. It was more of an attacking start to the opening. So his opponent responds with e5, keeping things even. And now Fischer plays bishop to c4 first. Now, I know the King's Gambit, you normally play f4 immediately, and this is the bishop's opening, but it'll probably transpose into the King's Gambit if Fischer plays f4. All right, so the opponent decides to play f6, and now we have knight to c3. Fischer just defends the pawn that was under attack here. And the game continues with bishop to c5. So both bishops are out. And also we have the bishop eyeing this weak f-pawn, the same as Fischer is doing here. So what will Fischer do next here? Well, he plays f4, and the computer says that this is an inaccuracy. Computer does not like this and instead recommends knight at g to e2 here. Now, why did Fischer play this? Well, it's kind of like the King's Gambit, although this, according to the computer, it's transposed into the Vienna game Anderson defense. Now, if you were playing the King's Gambit, you would immediately play e4. Your opponent would push this pawn to e5. And then on your second move, you would play f4, attacking this pawn. So it's kind of transposed. All right. We have d6 being played by the opponent. And apparently it would have been better to just push all the way to d5 here, attacking the pawn, attacking the bishop. Of course, that would just give up that pawn the knight could take. And then if knight captured knight, the bishop could recapture. But then that bishop could be chased away maybe by a pawn push. So continuing on, at this moment, the game gives Fischer just a slight edge, a 0.10 edge. So let's continue. Knight to f3 is played. And now we've transposed finally back into a King's Gambit declined classical variation. So, if you're not familiar with the King's Gambit, it can be a good surprise weapon. Basically, you push this f-pawn, trying to lure your opponent into capturing and pulling his central pawn off to the side. And then, that could allow you to push your other pawn. Here, you'd be able to attack the bishop. And you'd have more space in the center, more control of the center. And also, Fischer can't castle at the moment because of this bishop lined up here on the G1 square. But a lot of times in the King's Gambit, the king would castle, the rook would end up on this F file, and once this D pawn is pushed, often you can regain that F pawn that they capture. Okay, continue on. Bishop to g4. This looks like it's the first mistake in the game. And now the computer evaluates a +1 advantage for Fischer. Let's find out why this was a mistake. And before we do that, what was recommended? It looks like just knight to c6 would have been better. developing the knight before the bishop, which is a good general rule in chess. So we have h3, and this is a miss according to the computer that shifts the game back to a 0.1 advantage for black. So what does the computer recommend here? It looks like just capturing in the center. So now Fischer's opponent decides to capture the knight, and apparently that's the best move. Fischer, what does he do here? Well, of course, he recaptures with the queen, the best move. You develop a piece instead of capturing with the pawn, which would just leave you with doubled pawns here, and the king side would be broken. All right, and this is a common theme as well. As I mentioned, a lot of times you'll have the rook here with the queen lined up here. The pawn is lined up. So, what does Fischer's opponent do now? Well, finally, he does play knight to c6, although the computer prefers a capture of this f-pawn. So the game continues with d3 by Fischer, and apparently bishop to b5 is a recommendation of the computer, but that would break a rule of not moving a piece twice in the opening before you get all your pieces developed and your king castled. But by going here, bishop to b5, it would pin the knight to the king and maybe prevent this knight from jumping forward and chasing Fischer's queen, and also threatening a fork here of king and rook. So the game continues with knight to d4. So sure enough, Fischer's opponent finds the best move. And what does Fischer do here? Well, Fischer finds the best move in the position according to the computer, and he plays this crazy, great move according to the computer. He ignores what his opponent is threatening here of capturing with check and forking, taking the rook here. And instead, Fischer ignores all of that and counterattacks, which is a good plan. If you can ignore your opponent's attack in favor of an even stronger counterattack. So what is Fischer doing here? Well, he's probably maybe threatening to capture here. But would that work immediately? Because the rook could just move here. It would be protected by the knight. So maybe Fischer is also threatening to capture here. If the pawn captures, the queen could capture. You'd have a fork of king and bishop. So that's a possibility. A lot going on here. Let's see what happens. Well, sure enough, Fischer's opponent checks. A lot of beginning players, if they see a check, they'll immediately check. And sometimes it's better to hold off on that check and just let it hang in the air in the game. And your opponent will always be thinking about that check threat, for moves to come. So once you actually deliver the check, well, then it's, kind of over and done with. So what does Fischer do? And before we find out, let's see what the computer actually recommended. It looks like just castling to the king side is recommended by the computer. Taking care of that before trying to get an offensive attack going here. All right, the game continues with the king attacking that knight. And now we have the rook being captured, the best move. And Fischer's opponent, of course, grabs the material. And what does Fischer do? Well, he decides to go after this pawn here. Now it's unsafe and impossible for Fischer's opponent to castle kingside. So the king will be kind of stuck in the middle here for the moment, unless the queen would have time to move and the opponent could maybe castle queenside. So here, the best move is found by Fischer's opponent, rook to f8. Now, why didn't he attack here? I guess if he would have played rook to g8, let's see if that's even recommended by the computer. No. So that's not even showing up. I mean, I guess we could take a look at that. What if this was played? Well, then you'll see why that can't be played. Because Fischer can just capture here, and there's a mate in 1. All right, so, Fischer threatening here, and his opponent has to play rook to f8 to prevent that mate in 1 because the bishop and queen are lining up on that weak f pawn that was only protected by the king. So now the rook defends, and the game continues with Fischer capturing in the center. The opponent recaptures, keeping material, well, not quite even, keeping the trade even. At the moment, Fischer's opponent is ahead by a rook. So what does Fischer do next? Well, Fischer develops another piece here that was doing nothing in the corner. Now there's a possible threat of capturing that knight. Because queen, you have 2 attackers and 1 defender. All right, so Fischer's opponent finds the best move, and a great move according to the computer, just dropping this bishop back to help defend the knight along with the queen. So now what does Fischer do here? Well, Fischer just piles up the pressure, adding more pressure to that knight. The game continues with knight takes e4. So a big mistake here by Fischer's opponent. And after this mistake, Fischer is ahead by plus 3.7. Before that, Fischer was only ahead by the equivalent of half a pawn. So, perhaps the opponent was thinking that they could take here, threaten to capture here. There would be an attack on this bishop, 2 attackers. So let's see what happens. We have this capture, a mistake. Fischer just recaptures. But now the bishop is defended by 2 defenders here. So that plan didn't really work out. And now Fischer is really ahead here. The game continues with f5, attacking the knight, trying to get rid of this defender. But what does Fischer do here? He finds this move, ignoring this attack on his knight and taking the bishop here. And this is a brilliant move according to the computer. So if we go back, it looks like, of course, that is the best move. Fischer ignores this attack on his knight, and his opponent is still ahead in material here. But, of course, this knight is trapped. All right, the great move by Fischer. Let's see why this move is so great. The best thing here, it apparently, it looks like queen to d7 would be the best move, but another mistake by Fischer's opponent. He goes after the material here, and I guess he completely overlooked this check move here. And this ends the game because, what can Fischer's opponent do? If the rook blocks, well, then Fischer can just take, and it's checkmate there. If the king tries to move here, if the king tries to run, well, then it's checkmate here with the queen. What's the other option? If the king moves forward, then queen would checkmate here. So let's see what Fischer's opponent should have done instead of going after that material. It looks like queen to d7 would have been best. But then you have queen to g6. King runs to d8. And now knight to c5, attacking the queen. Queen gets out of the line of fire and counterattacks Fischer's queen. And what's recommended here? It looks like bishop takes with check. The best thing to do is capture. And now what? Queen to g7. Fischer just would have had a brutal attack anyway. And where does the king go here? King to d6 is best, running here. If the king goes up to e8, then what? The queen would just take this pawn with check. So I'll play the best move just so we could see, what could have happened. Looks like d4 protects the knight. Rook at a to e8. They recommend that. And now b4. And it's bad when the top move now is to just capture the knight. Anyway, I'm going to wrap it up there. Kind of what you expected if Fischer plays an average chess player in a simultaneous exhibition. He's just going to run over them. And, if they make mistakes, of course, he's usually just going to punish those mistakes pretty severely. And it was kind of a roundabout way to get to the King's Gambit, but that's just another good example of how transposition can play a big part in chess, where you can start out with one opening and transpose into an opening that you want. And maybe that's what Fischer did to help confuse his opponent, who was probably not familiar with all the variations in those different openings. All right. Well, before I wrap it up, let's take a quick look at the review here. Can you see that? Yes. So it looks like Fischer played with 90.9% accuracy. His opponent played with 65.2% accuracy. And, that's probably to be expected if one of us, average players, went up against a world champion player, we would pretty much be destroyed. All right, so Fischer had one brilliant move and 4 great moves. His opponent had 1 great move. And the bad moves, it looks like 2 inaccuracies by Fischer and 1 by his opponent, but his opponent had 4 mistakes and Fischer had 1 miss. And it looks like Fischer played at a 2500 rating level and his opponent played at a 1900 level. In the opening, according to the computer, Fischer had only an 89.3% accuracy rating in the opening. Probably because he was transposing through different variations, different openings, and he probably didn't play the main lines that his opponent would expect, and it appeared to have confused his opponent some. All right, his opponent played at 88.9% accuracy, and Fischer played with 92% accuracy in the middle game versus only 46.8% by his opponent. All right, well, I hope you enjoyed this, kind of shorter video, just a little glimpse into Fischer playing the King's Gambit in a roundabout way. Feel free to leave comments. I always enjoy what viewers and subscribers have to say. Feel free to say whatever you want, good or bad. Also, like and subscribe to support the channel if you haven't already. Thank you for watching and have a super chess day.